Okay, fantastic. Well, let's call this meeting to order. It's Wednesday, October 26th, a few minutes after noon, and we'll start with some introductions. I'm the chair, Pete Peterson, and next to me,
Christopher Longstead.
those on the phone. I believe Suzanne France is on the phone.
And Deanna.
And Diaz. Okay. All right, well, we have a quorum. Member Quint Davison has been excused. And so I guess we'll go right on down to new business. And so there's a resolution proposing amendments to Alaska Statute Title 15, voter registration, and Ms. Hines. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Would now be an appropriate time to ask to amend the agenda to add the conflict of interest topic to be discussed later as item number C.
We can certainly do that. Are there any objections from members to add that to our agenda today? Not hearing any. This will be the item C under new business today.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Back to the resolution proposing amendments to Alaska Statutes Title 15 relating to voter registration. I provided to you a resolution of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly recommending amendments to the Alaska Statutes Title 15 related to voter registration. This comes from the Election Commission, who reviewed and approved a very similar, if not exact, resolution at their October 7th meeting. This stems from a March 3, 2022 discussion with the Division of Elections regarding voter registration. Alaska has a robust and successful registration process. However, it can take up to 8 years to remove a voter from the rolls if the voters are not proactive. We see a significant number of ballot packages returned undeliverable each year. We've seen 10,000, in excess of 10,000 in 2021 and over 15,000 in 2022. And some of the tools that are available to the division that would help with voter registration list maintenance include of the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is ERIC. This is a cooperative between states where if somebody is registered in another state, it'll notify other states where those voters have become registered. And it's our understanding that at this point, the division is unable to remove those folks from the rolls because it is not voter contact. There's also the National Change of Address, which has another tool available where in addition to changing your address, you can update your voter registration. And it's thought that these two tools could be helpful in updating the voter registration. The Election Commission also asked for this to be added to your legislative priorities. So the Anchorage Assembly resolution that I put forth before you includes all of the recommended amendments. Section 3 is where we get into the meat of it, which I had told the Election Commission that I am not a policymaker, but so I just put some edits before them. If a registered voter has not, within the preceding 2 calendar years, contacted the division and has not voted or appeared to vote in any local, regional, primary, special, or general election during the last 2 calendar years, a notice is sent to the voter, and if it is returned undeliverable, then they are made inactive. And then if they stay inactive for another 2 full years, at that point the division can remove them. So this reduces the timeline from 8 years to 4 years. Like I said, after 2 years, they move to inactive and the division attempts to contact them. If they are unable to contact them, then they are deactivated. And I just want to point out that each year that you file for your PFD is also considered contact. So, so voters who maybe only vote in presidential elections every 4 years, as long as they're applying for their PFD every year, the division is getting contact. So they would not be removed. They would not be moved into inactive at all because they would still be considered active because the division is getting contact from them through the PFD.
And so if someone files for a permanent fund dividend, they're automatically registered. I mean, that was the way it was for a while. Is that still the way it is?
That's my understanding, and they get a file from the state, from the PF, the Division of Elections gets a file from the division, the permanent fund dividend division, and then they incorporate that as last contact,
Okay.
whether the information changes or not.
All right. Well, so, you're required to put your address down when you're filing for the permanent fund dividend, and so obviously if your address is not within the state of Alaska, that would be a red flag.
Right.
And,
Yeah. So another piece of this,
Ms. Jones.
Through the chair, keep in mind though that many people who have applied for PFDs for years, it's electronic and it goes directly to your bank account. So your address is, your residence address is somewhat insignificant in the PFD application. And there are lots of people who do live outside of Alaska who are entitled to a PFD. For example, students or, I'm not sure about military, but if this is your residence. So I don't think that there's a flag on the PFDs that they specifically check people who have an out-of-state address. So that isn't a tool that I understand that the Division of Elections is using to not pay PFDs to people who are outside of Alaska. I think those tools are beyond the scope of this discussion.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. There is one thing that happened, I think it was 2 years ago, not this last election, the one before, and I'm not sure if it's been corrected, but I had a number of friends when they implemented the PFD voter registration that the automatic registration process changed their residence address to their banking address. And so people who were residing and wanting to vote in the municipal election found that they had been, their registration had been moved, their location, and so they weren't able to vote. Maybe it wasn't the assembly races, maybe it was the state candidates. They wanted to vote in the district they lived in, but the state rejected them and made them vote a question ballot. And so, anyhow, I don't know if that's been fixed, but it's certainly worth looking at.
Ms. Jones?
I recall this happening, and the state's position is this: when Jamie said they get your application for a PFD, they send you a postcard. And so with automatic voter registration is an opt-out. And so they send you a postcard that says, you got your PFD and you're going to be automatically registered unless you contact us. And it also says, this is the address we're going to mail your PFD to, or this is the address that we believe is your voter registration. And so if you don't respond to us, we're changing your address. And so that opt-out is more of a burden on voters. I had a specific circumstance where a voter that had run for statewide office used his office address downtown to get his PFD. So he was not on the voter list for his district and unable to vote in that election. So I do not know if that has been fixed or if the division is even willing to address that. I don't know, but my understanding is a lot of their issues are, it's the voter was informed and it's the voter's duty to get back to them. We've heard that quite a bit from them.
So it's the voter's responsibility to get their correct address updated with the state so they can actually vote in the district they live in. That would make sense. Ms. Hines?
Yeah, that's our understanding, is the voter contact is key here.
Great.
I can just imagine the nightmare scenario where they move my registration and I'm no longer eligible to serve. Anyhow, it's kind of a moot question, but what a nightmare.
Okay.
Another
continue.
piece of the resolution which the Election Commission approved is adding a new section to state law that allows the director to use notification from the Electronic Registration Information Center or other similar agency that when a voter has registered to vote in a different state, that the director may cancel that voter's registration in Alaska. And it also adds a section that allows the director to cancel a voter's registration if the voter has used the National Change of Address form and has indicated that they wanted to change their voter's registration to the new state. And it adds a new section of state law indicating that a voter registering in a new state is prima facie evidence that the voter no longer wants to be registered to vote in Alaska. And so then the director could cancel the voter's registration at that point. And then finally, it recommended the policies of the Division of Elections be amended to cooperate and share voter email addresses and phone numbers with municipalities, ideally through their voter registration database and shielded from public view, so that the email and phone number information could be used by a municipality for voting related purposes, such as contacting the voter to cure. So that is briefly what the Election Commission's resolution and this draft resolution for the Assembly states. And so if there, I'll leave it to you guys to discuss if you want that to go forth to the Assembly agenda.
Okay, thank you. The organization, I guess it's called ERIC.
Right.
And not, am I correct in saying that not all states are members?
That's correct. I don't remember if the number is 32 or 36, but it's in that range that states participate in that cooperative.
So it would be great if we could get all 50 states cooperating and working together, so that, because obviously some of those other states are probably having voters who moved out of that state and they still have them on the rolls, just as we do here in Alaska as well. Any discussion from members of the committee about moving this forward? What do you think about that idea?
So for me, section 1, I wonder why we don't send it to all legislators.
Send it to all legislators?
Yeah, I just don't know why we would narrow it just to Anchorage representatives. Instead, I would suggest we change that one slightly and send it to everybody.
Ms. Jones?
Yes,
Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, one of the things that we thought is that you probably need someone to introduce this in the legislature. We can send a resolution, and so we were just probably guessing. But if you would like to give us specific direction, we can send it to all of them. But I don't think I understand exactly how the legislative package works. We can present it, but then what happens to it? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. Is there anything else in here that needs to say what happens next?
Well, the State Affairs Committee and both the House and Senate would be the committees of jurisdiction in this matter. And so if we knew who was going to chair those committees or knew a member of those committees, we could contact them and see if they might be interested in introducing a bill similar to this. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, I just think that I would change it to read the copies of this resolution shall be forwarded to all Alaska legislators. And then what we do, and if it passes, gets in the legislative package, then we hand it to Wendy Chamberlain and say, get this out there. And that way we can send it. I'm sure there's an email that goes to all legislators and run it through our formal channels.
Wendy Chamberlain is a lobbyist hired by the municipality of Anchorage and has been for a number of years. It seems like a reasonable idea, Mr. Constant. So,
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do we want to leave the lieutenant governor and governor on there, or just?
I believe we should definitely leave the lieutenant governor on there because it's their role to run state elections. So,
And the governor has the authority to veto, therefore we should have it on their agenda as well.
so is there interest in amending this? By the way, this is still a draft. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if there's no objections, I'm happy to amend it, section 2, that copies of this resolution be forwarded to all Alaska legislators, the lieutenant governor, and the governor.
That would be agreeable with me, Mr. Constant.
I would also take that date out. It's strangely specific and maybe after the fact. The sense of the body, I think, is that we want to get the legislative package adopted and out before the beginning of the year, so pre-filing can happen if we find support and champion. And so,
Yeah, hundreds of bills.
My thought about that was that's today the new, if I send it now, it might be completely different.
Yeah, hundreds of bills are set up to be introduced as soon as the legislature gathers in. So,
and for the most part, after November 8th, they will know who they are. And they will begin, even if they're not sworn in, if they're new, if they're incumbent, for sure, filing pre-filed bills. So it's the month of December when the early action happens. And so we definitely want to try to figure out how to get it there before, the anchor is pulled and the legislature is sailing out to sea.
but committee assignments are not always set up until the caucuses are complete. Nobody knows when that will end sometimes. Mr. Gates?
Thank you. I just had a thought that when you say you have the election, you don't know which is changing, but I also think that will take some time to set up their meeting addresses or offices where legislators who are really seated, and when exactly that will happen. But I guess my thought is that there's a profile of bills that and just for timing and sort of considerations, you want to send this a week or two like for pre-filing deadline, and I think by then I'm not sure when it is, but I think though that filing this directive can determine most effective time to send this stuff out, and I trust that they will do so. But yeah, there's a lot of things to consider since we have an election for 59 of 60 seats, right? Or some, anyways, I just wanted to add that part about the precisely deadline, not sort of pivot point for this, I understand.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Gates. Any other discussion on this item?
I guess that I'll just make a motion that we recommend moving this to the body for introduction. Ms.
All right.
LaFrance?
Are there objections from any other members of the committee? Not hearing any objections, so we will be forwarding this to the legislature. Well, forget it, we actually forward this to our agenda, actually. Ms. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to suggest that because you have several members that are absent and we don't want to have a violation of the Open Meetings Act, that the clerk's office would like to make the changes you have suggested and add as sponsors Mr. Peterson, Mr. Constant, and Ms. LaFrance. And then if the other members would like to be added as sponsors, of course, they can do that at any time. Would that be satisfactory?
Certainly, that's an excellent idea.
I don't know. I mean, yes, and if we could also add submitted by Ethics and Election Committee, because we have a quorum. There's a majority here and no objection. So it doesn't really matter. We can be the sponsors, but the recommendation from the committee is an actual recommendation, even though there are two members not here.
Ms.
I
Jones?
think, through the chair, I think we've been careful about doing that and having committees sponsor, and I think the clerk's office would like to err on the side of caution and have the 3 individual members rather than the committee sponsor. I know this came up at a Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. You can state on the record at the assembly meeting that this is what happened, but I think we would still prefer individual members as the sponsors.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead with the 3 members of the committee who are present today as sponsors on this. All right, fantastic. Let's move forward. We have
Just
another item.
a last point on that note.
Oh, okay, Mr. Constant.
And I don't mind, that's fine, but I believe that that conversation was the decision of members of that committee wanting always only to make a recommendation if it's unanimous. I don't think it's policy, I don't think it's practice, other than that committee, who somehow that thought has, I believe, bled outward into other processes. I don't necessarily think that we're bound by that. So, and I recognize there are questions of open meetings rules, and, keeping it simple is probably the best argument, but I just want to note for sure that was an orientation of a member who communicated it, and that committee bought it, and somehow that's bled out into general policy. I don't know if I agree with it. For this case, it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Mr. Gates.
Yeah, thank you. We did have I guess, go to code reference on this issue about counties making recommendations. We did have, I think, a recent code amendment that said counties don't sponsor or make motions to, so it's sort of mirrored, I think, we make a recommendation and then have all the counties sponsor. So I think it makes more sense to, maybe note in or whereas the county who really did this that vote and what it was, but the names of sponsors is, it sort of conflicts with that code that says counties don't make motions to, counties don't move to terms in the way that ordinates or resolution. Anyways, I'll try to find that code reference. I'm not sure if it's been put into the online codification yet.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gates. Any other discussion on this item before we move on from the agenda? Not seeing any. Let's go down to the next item under new business. Resolution recommending amendments to Alaska Statute Title 15 relating to providing postage to voters for mailing in mail ballots.
Through the chair, the second resolution is requesting the state of Alaska amend state statutes to allow persons to offer items of nominal value to encourage persons to vote, such as postage to mail in a ballot. I cannot remember the exact number resolution. This was passed on July 14th of 2020. It's my understanding that Mr. Gates drafted this and I file saved as and changed it to 22. So the only change that I made is in the fifth whereas, it says in an informal verbal communication, and then I added in 2020. The Attorney General's office advised it concurred with the Assembly Council's legal opinion, just because that was when, it's my understanding, Mr. Gates had that conversation. And the last thing is that Section 2 says that copies of this resolution shall be forwarded to Alaska legislators within the municipality of Anchorage, and I can also change that one to all if that's the wish on this one. This is the one that I copied for the last one.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. Go ahead and send this to everyone, all the legislators, and also the lieutenant governor and governor. Yeah, we've actually been kicking this idea around for 4 or 5 years now. And the situation we find ourselves in now is that if stamps were given to people, it could actually be a felony if I was reading the statute correctly. $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison for giving someone a stamp seems like a little onerous to me.
Just a little.
If I can just add a quick, I found a typo that I would change. Section 3, the request shall be incorporated in the municipality's 2023 legislative program.
2023, okay, great. Thank you. Any questions from the committee or additional discussions about this particular item? Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, would you like this item submitted by all 3 of the members of the committee present as well?
It's up to Mr. Costed and Ms. LaFrance if they're interested in being the co-sponsor on this item.
No objection.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Constant said he was good to go. So, and was that LaFrance on, Ms. LaFrance on
Yes.
speaker? Okay, great.
That was me.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Okay, so yes, you can list all 3 of us. Any other discussion or about this item? Not seeing any, we will go to the new item that we added to our agenda today, which is an update of the conflict of interest questions the Assembly uses. And I believe we have Dee Ennis online that will walk us through this. Ms. Ennis?
Thank you. And Jamie, has Suzanne received my little outline and a copy of that code section?
Yes.
Okay, great. So for the committee's interest, what I've done is this has been a very painful process, obviously, the questions and the disclosure. So the plan was I would take a first look at it. We had looked at it, by the way, at the Ethics Board, but we got boggled down. And, go ahead. Oh, I didn't know someone was interrupting. And so I would try to do something simple, bring it to this group first, and then probably to a Rules Committee meeting. And then I am on the Ethics Board agenda for like the third week of November. And Terry initially was going to be here. Terry, the past chair for about 10 years, but then couldn't make it. So first, a little bit of context or background here. The first of all is if you look at that code section E, right, so the big section is conflict of interest 1.15.160, but go down to section E. That's where all those questions are. The first thing is these were never meant to be questions. They're factors. And so if you read it, it says with evaluation and balancing of these factors. Where these became questions, I believe, was after the infamous Amy Nabowski repetitive disclosures about firefighter husband. And nobody knew what to do with all that, and Amy pointed out, well, somebody has to ask some questions. She went to the ethics board. But at any rate, these weren't meant to be the questions, and that's why it's so confusing. They are also from the old code. 2007, I think the old code was put in. They weren't redone by under this current or the last code rewrite. Why do you care? Well, ethics for the MOA, you got to comply with the ethics code. The state ethics law simply says municipalities need a conflict of interest section, provides no further guidance. But this is important for for state court law cases, because if there is no disclosure or particular inadequate disclosure, the case it can be rendered void. I'm not sure we've ever had that in Anchorage. Some further backup, the code, if you look at of your code section A, minor or substantial conflict of interest, the code recognizes that in a representative democracy, the representatives are drawn from society and therefore cannot and should not be without financial interest. Well, that's especially true of assembly people. You have contributors, you're involved with businesses, you do your community councils, you have interests, you belong to associations, you're employees, you have interests everywhere. So it is important to try to figure out how to, which are important and which are not. Some examples in the past is Amy's firefighter. Mayor Sullivan owned that restaurant. That restaurant was right behind that we did the expansion of the bid and a large assessment. And actually that did go to the ethics board, and he was not allowed to participate. His municipal manager had to do all of that. But think about this, if there's a food code change, should he necessarily be precluded? A couple other ones. Fourth, this has come up a couple of times, he's on the Park and Rec Foundation. What can he do and not do with respect to Parks and Rec Department itself? I'll discuss training a little bit later on, but his wife was a school teacher. And you look at that, well, yeah, but was she a teacher? Isn't that negotiated, the contract negotiated by the union? Doesn't the assembly just have the power to go up and down? So attenuated. And then I'll discuss another training one later. Okay, biggest problem, the disclosures are absolutely terrible. So for instance, 2 meetings ago, picking on a new member, Daniel, 2 meetings ago, he said he had an interest and said not another word. He never explained it to the group. Now, Suzanne, I asked Suzanne about that later on, out of morbid curiosity, quite frankly, and she said, oh, I knew he had already disclosed it to me. He, in fact, had disclosed it to me and Terry in a training session for new members. But that's what the public heard, and interest, and not one person asked a question about it. And that was where he was subleasing from NESR, and NESR was getting a contract award on something totally unrelated. Never came up to the public. So also a very important point, these are public disclosures. In the old days, Terry and I would meet quite frequently on Tuesday afternoons with Felix to run through some of these. So we want to change it. So my initial suggestion, I hope Terry would be here, is that if you look at the page that is entitled adequate disclosures, is take out that entire E section, because those questions make they're not questions, they make little sense. And to me, the emphasis should be on adequate disclosure. And by the way, by you defining what you think is adequate disclosure, that will be helpful in any state court cases that came up, because, hey, I followed this. So, for instance, first thing is identify the interest. And people seem to have trouble with individual versus entity. This would say, okay, including immediate family or household members. So it gives you sort of the definition right off the bat, or entity. Then another factor, past, present, future, or ongoing. Jamie, in 3 meetings ago, on the Mario confirmation, disclosed that he had, I believe she said, a business relationship or a past relationship with Mario. But never said what it was. Is it ongoing? Is it business? Are they developing something together? Do they belong to a church choir? I mean, what is that relationship? So I think the time thing is, and this is easy, past, present, future, ongoing, for the person to explain that. How is the interest related to the action before the assembly? So you're letting the disclosure try to figure that out. And by the way, Chris, I want to run through your Aquila thing through here, this in a minute. In fact, let's just do that. I think that'd be easier. So, Chris, when they were 3 years ago, when they were talking about whether the Golden Mine would be a substance abuse center, somebody said, well, Chris has a conflict of interest because at that point he worked for Aquila House. So if you go through this analysis, so Chris would say, yeah, at the entity I work for, Aquila, I'm an employee. It's an ongoing relationship. How is the interest related to the action? Well, if Golden Mine becomes a treatment center, and if there's an RFP, and if Aquila wins that RFP, I will maintain my employment. So you could see right there, it becomes to the next. It goes to that next one. The impact is it direct, attenuated, or unrelated. And of course, Daniel Volan ones were very unrelated. It was these are contracts somewhere else in the city, had nothing to do with the property that he rented from. But I think you could have the assembly person explain that. Then the next one, if direct or attenuated, I'm not sure attenuated should be in there. If direct impact, is there a financial impact? Identify and quantify. Do we want to say quantify? And by the way, so after I go through this quickly, I'd like to go through some of these things with you. And could they be better stated, different orders?
So
my sixth text number, go ahead.
Well, let's walk through this, because you put the Aquila example, and I'm lost at number 2. So the idea is to put into the municipality's assets a building for a treatment center. Okay, so I work as an employee of a treatment provider, and that's ongoing. But how is that related to the action? It's not, because we're not looking to buy the building. We have no proposal that's coming to provide the services, and in fact, we don't provide any services to the municipality.
Right. So great. That made you come up with all those good words.
Unrelated.
Well, okay, so there's a good point, Chris. So are these conclusory statements to causing grief?
So I think, now that I think about it, what we ought to do when we get to the point where we're shopping these questions around, or not questions, factors around, is make up some kind of a game at a rules committee where everybody walks through some of their personal interests or professional interests, and we talk about scenarios where items may come before the body, and we role play through some of these things and reality test these factors to what we have going on, because
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Okay.
And before we introduce something, like, let's work it out.
Yeah, that sounds like something we can do at a rules committee meeting.
No, and I would love your input, Chris. When Forrest was on this body, Terry and I came a couple times, and they totally turned around what we wanted to do, and we both went, wow, that was very interesting input. So I think that you were vital, and that process would be excellent.
Somehow
and I'd like to do that before. Go ahead.
We're gonna fix your microphone.
You're gonna what?
We have a microphone for you.
You got quiet all of a sudden, but now you're back.
Okay.
You can go again.
Continue, Dean.
So, okay. So I think that's an excellent idea. And then is the interest shared by large group? So all taxpayer, all restaurant owners.
Or all treatment providers.
Yeah, all treatment providers. And to flesh one out, that's the one that nobody understands of the factors. The one that talks about, is it an interest generally possessed by the public or a large class of persons? Nobody understands that. But that's what that's about. So here's where training comes up. Dick Cheney, veteran, introduces an ordinance that would provide a property tax exemption for veterans. Is that a conflict of interest? And he actually went to the ethics board for that. Well, no, it's really, all veterans share that. Is that, but, as long as he discloses it, then all of you can decide. But that one that nobody understands too, I think the ethics people is like, well, yeah, but if it belongs to everybody, it's like all taxpayers. So one of, Dick Cheney introduces, any kind of property tax exemption. It helps him, but it helps all taxpayers. So anyway, I don't know how to further. And by the way, the very bottom of my page says training. What we have always lacked is an hour on just this, and not, the whole, whenever we do the ethics training for the group, we get stuck on politics and, other stuff, gifts. But this deserves its own hour to 2 hour training or rules committee once we arrive at it. It really deserves its own time to go through some of this. This is one that baffles me, number 6. Is there a private interest in the outcome? So here, Daniel, when he did his disclosure about NISR, later on in the meeting, they were talking about the mayor trying to use rec centers as a shelter, and Daniel was talking about, oh yeah, I go there all the time because I distribute food out of that area. Well, that's a personal interest, or private interest, which he didn't disclose. And I went, that's interesting. I wanted Terry to discuss, there's a series of cases before the ethics board about this personal or private interest, and to explain it a little bit more to us. Because yeah, go ahead.
So I looked at that note you have on the page here, and I don't know that that's accurate. It's not that he's using it for food distribution. He participates in a Rotary food distribution event that happens there every 3 weeks. There's a substantial difference.
Okay.
So he's a member of a group that's involved in distributing food, is that correct?
Yes, as opposed to him running a food distribution effort at the place. There's this thing that happens and he joins it. It's much like serving a nonprofit board or participating in this or that event.
Okay, but Chris, there's the problem. I, member of public, fought this use for food distribution that he had, and I think his words were, well, I run a food distribution or something. But so I, as public, was totally confused. And I, as former ethics attorney, said, and why wasn't that disclosed? Along with, because I have an interest. Again, these are public ones as well.
So that's the question. If a liquor licensee has their liquor license up and I regularly go there to have dinner, do I have to disclose that I have dinner at that place? Right, that's where you get to with that example, even though it's lack of communication and disclosure is what makes it unclear. The reality is no, you don't have to disclose that you have dinner at Ginger if you're appropriating or not appropriating, authorizing the special land use permit change for Ginger. That's the level of uncertainty, I think.
Yeah.
Right, because you're a member of a large group, hopefully a large enough group that this restaurant can stay in business, so, yeah. Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, I think that this question, is there a private interest, is so important. And I think that people really struggle with The code talks about financial interest or a private interest. And I don't think that we have spent enough time distinguishing the difference between those types of interests. I think everybody gets the financial one. Actually, Meg, even last night, was talking about her personal interest, which is more interesting because there's no money coming to her personally or her organization. But she's talking about the personal interest. But I'll tell you another one that struck me the most. And this was when Bill Starr made a disclosure, and it concerned construction in some neighborhood. And it must have been affecting people's driveways or something like that. And Bill said, "It's my friend." Well, somebody went through the questions and said, is the financial interest, they focused on the financial interest. And he said, and they said, "No, you don't have a conflict." And he said, "It's my friend. I do not want to vote on this." And so I think because the questions are mashed together, or factors, I will say, and financial comes first, and that's usually what the disclosure is, we need to do something differently, like, maybe it's at number one, we identify the interest is financial or personal, and then maybe even address the factors differently. But anyway, just wanted to put that out there, that I think personal interests are much harder.
Right, and that is probably something that we need to take a little closer look at it and maybe have a longer discussion about that. Because if a member does not feel comfortable in voting on an issue because they believe they have a conflict, they've got conflict. And so they should be able to recuse themselves. And right now, we are not necessarily allowing them to recuse themselves because their particular conflict doesn't fit in the rules and the questions that we've been using for the last decade or whatever, 15 years. And so yeah, that's something that I think we need to discuss a little further. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. The best example for me, unlike the one you talked about, Mr. Starr, remember, Barbara, but was when Eric Croft was forced by the body to vote on his parents' liquor license, special land use or conditional use. That was very shocking to me. I voted no, but the body, by majority, said yes, we will vote on this. And I don't know how that could have happened, but it did. And that changes my perspective on how we define conflicts. And that's narrow. And I don't mind narrow, the code commands us to vote, but it certainly should be something we have robust discussion about.
And I'm hoping that the ethics board can help us, because they have a series of decisions coming out as we speak about personal, this whole issue of personal. And it's Becky that they may put in the word personal. So and they're waiting there. These are confidential opinions, so they have to scrub them before we can see them. But I do think, yeah, the personal one, it baffles me. Other than what you're talking about, this sort of, obvious quick tie, but what else is personal?
Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, I wonder if we need to start keeping track of some of these disclosures and how the body has ruled. Dee has given some really good examples, like if your spouse is a school teacher, that one is pretty easy, but it's important. But what if your spouse is a fire person? So we could keep track of these, and we could say they're not binding, but at least they would be helpful. And I think I would agree with Mr. Constant that I think it is clearly personal interest if your parents or another family member had a liquor license before the body.
I remember, this was a long time ago, my father was president of the local school board in my hometown, and I remember him getting a phone call from one of the members of that school board who said that they were not going to vote on this particular item because they had a conflict. And this conversation went on the phone for 15 or 20 minutes to decide whether they had a conflict or not. And I don't know whether eventually how that all turned out. But obviously the person who felt they had a conflict was conflicted enough that they did not want to vote on that particular item. I don't even remember what it was, but in those days it was the person that felt they had a conflict that would just recuse themselves and leave the room. Like I said, this was a long time ago, but anyway. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So that's the fine line, right? So why we don't want to get to the point where members don't want to take hard votes, right? The whole point of us being up there in the code section as is written that you have to vote, you have a duty to vote, is because the hard votes are what we are hired to take. And that recusal is traditionally in the past been used as a scapegoat, an opportunity to not have to make the hard call. And so Barbara, you suggested something very interesting, tracking conflicts, disclosures. And I'm not sure what that mechanically would look like. They happen on the dais, they happen in committee, they happen in work sessions. And I think it would be an excellent protection for the members and for the public to have a log of disclosures that are made and how the body ruled, the chair of the body, so that it could always be something members could look back to where and when it happened. And so I don't know what that would look like from a duties perspective or mechanics perspective, but I like that idea.
Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, we could probably do it at a regular or special meeting if there are disclosures. We have a minutes clerk and we have staff for that. It would get a little bit more complicated if we were doing it at committees and work sessions. So, my idea is let's take a little bite at it. And if, when we get this redone, we can implement that at the same time and start keeping track of it. And then we'll go from there. If the body, one of the things that the members could do is if you make a disclosure at a committee meeting, you can repeat it at the regular meeting.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. And we're down to about 3 minutes left in our scheduled meeting time today. Just want to bring that up. Mr. Gates?
Thanks. I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to add my perspective of this issue. Is the root keys, whether there's a substantial private interest in the matter or not, and the word substantial is kind of subjective. And this is why we have these sort of fact. It's weird fact intensive inquiry. And I say that because it makes me think that every co-op example used in Spell's legal license, I think it all depended on the facts. There are what is that we call Spell's legal license. They only obtained it because the state said they had to. They wanted to have wine shipped to their home for their private use. So they weren't upgrading a store into a store for profit, but depending on the income and stuff like that. I think the facts were different. He would have been, maybe would have decided his interest was substantial because of the family members' use of their license, but it was because they didn't resell or anything. They just wanted to have wine shipped up to Alaska from out of state. They had to get the license, and they were just renewing it out. So that's what I would call that. Why I was like, or it sort of makes sense that it could go on. But I can understand that sort of disclosure can fall on either side of the substantial interest question.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Well, so we're running out of time here, and so Dee, do you think we need to bring in a member of the Board of Ethics and continue this discussion at a Rules Committee meeting, or what do you think?
Yeah,
about the next
I
step?
would really like to get the Assembly's take on this and discussion before I go to the Assembly meeting, which is like the third week, not Assembly, the Ethics meeting, which is the third week, and have a pretty, hey, this is what. Now, if there's a Rules Committee meeting, obviously not tomorrow, but in a week or 10 days where I can get Terry or Becky to come to hear this at the Rules Committee. I think would be very helpful.
Okay, well, we'll keep in communications with you, and when we get the next Rules Committee scheduled, we can see if that'll fit in with the schedule of the members of the Board of Ethics. How's
Okay.
that sound?
Yeah, just a little bit of warning is what we need.
All right, great. Mr. Costa?
Yeah, just a quick note, my recollection of the license, it was an import-export license for their wines they're growing import license in Oregon to bring them up to Alaska. So it wasn't quite so attenuated as just so they could bring them to have to drink. It was an actual license, but that's fact-specific, I guess, is the main point.
Well, and I sampled some of that wine, so do I have a conflict? I guess not. Well, we're down to the last minute or so here, and so let's go to audience participation. Are there any members of the audience that would like to participate? Yes, ma'am. Come up to the microphone and introduce yourself, please.
You don't think you can hear me from here on the microphone? Susan Riley, Midtown. I really like the idea of tracking the disclosures, not only for the purposes of disclosure, but also because when you get a database like that over time, you can then use that information to kind of refine your questions and your factors. I think it's a bonus idea. Thank you.
Right, it would inform new members coming in as to what might be a conflict and what might not be. Thank you. Anyone else in the audience out there that would like to participate? Is anyone online? You need to unmute. It's *6, I believe. Not hearing from anyone, I will accept the motion for adjournment. So moved. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks, Dee.
Thank you.